Foundation, 200,000, schizophrenia, 80,000, Huntington's chorea, 600, epilepsy, 60,000, blindness, 4,000, hereditary deafness, 16,000, grave bodily malformation, 20,000, hereditary alcoholism, 10,000, and as well as many other specified groups. The law was repeatedly amended to close loopholes that might allow some persons with disabilities to escape sterilization. For example, an amendment was added to cover women with a quote-unquote hereditary disease who became pregnant prior to sterilization, or women who were impregnated by men with such quote-unquote hereditary diseases. In such cases, the law officially sanctioned abortion and simultaneous sterilization. To make the distinction between the quote-unquote healthy and unhealthy even clearer, the law further stipulated heavy penalties for physicians carrying out such actions on persons or unborn children legally judged to be quote-unquote healthy. Also in 1933, the Nazis enacted the law against dangerous habitual criminals, the statutes of which further blurred the distinction between bona fide criminal behavior and inappropriate behavior that characterized many people with disabilities. The law stipulated that these criminal asocials could be committed to state asylums, could be held in indeterminate protective custody, and in the case of sex offenders, officially castrated. These and other laws were the precursors to the Nuremberg laws of 1935, which, while directed primarily at Jews, also regulated marriage among people with disabilities. For example, the marriage health law prohibited marriage between two people when either party suffered from some form of mental disability and had a quote-unquote hereditary disease, as previously defined by law, or when one or both partners suffered from a contagious disease, particularly tuberculosis or venereal diseases. To this point, while Nazi law had become increasingly segregationist and isolationist for people with disabilities, it had not yet sanctioned murder, even though it is clear that as early as 1935, Hitler had indicated that he would use the cover of war to murder psychiatric patients in fulfillment of a long-held belief that he had previously articulated in Mein Kampf. What better way to influence the public than by means of propaganda? By 1938, the tide of public and official benevolence towards people with disability had begun to turn. The public mind now characterized people with disabilities as separate, different, often criminalized group of people with less economic value than their counterparts without disabilities. German literature and art soon celebrated lives unworthy of living in a host of propagandistic projects. For example, two 1935 silent documentaries produced largely for distribution among Nazi Party functionaries and sympathizers depicted people with severe physical and intellectual disabilities in staged scenes to show them at their greatest disadvantage. Other films were produced for wider audiences. A 1935 propaganda sound film, Das Erbe, The Inheritance, depicted in a pseudoscientific format the medical, social, and economic consequences of hereditary diseases. Read disabilities. More soon followed. 1937's Opfer der Vergangenheit, The Victim of the Past, went much further, comparing healthy, ideal German citizens with institutionalized people with severe disabilities and emphasizing that Jewish mental patients were creations that violated natural law. The film's solution, of course, compulsory sterilization. Propaganda was not limited to film, however, but soon appeared in German literature. An exemplar in this area was the novel Sendung und Gewissen, Mission and Conscience, which was turned into a very popular film, Ich klage an, or I Accuse. In this story, a young, beautiful woman suffering from multiple sclerosis decides that her life is no longer worth living and requests a quote-unquote merciful death at the hand of her husband, a physician, conveniently. In a grim death scene climax, he administers the fatal injection to his wife, who dies peacefully to the strains of soothing piano music played by a friend in the next room. At his trial, the doctor heroically refuses to allow his colleagues to invent an alibi for the murder, challenging the court by asking, and I quote, "Would you, if you were a cripple, want to vegetate forever. Predictably, the court acquits the physician, finding him not only not guilty, but that his actions were indeed merciful, a notion reinforced in the closing scenes where the words of the Renaissance physician Paracelsus are recalled that, quote-unquote, medicine is love. This type of propaganda, fueled by then current perceptions of disability and euthanasia, profoundly affected the German public. By 1938, thousands of requests for mercy killing were being received by Nazi officials. For example, requests were received from a woman ill with terminal cancer and from a man who had been severely injured and blinded in a construction accident. The state was also receiving similar requests from parents of newborns and young infants with severe physical and intellectual disabilities. The state, by this point, had implicitly made the case for killing people with disabilities. Now was the time to explicitly begin the killing process. In other words, Nazi involvement in actual mercy killing was sanctioned, but not operationalized by the state at this point. However, requests for mercy deaths were increasingly considered acceptable. The threshold for beginning official, explicit killing of people with disabilities can be traced, at least in part, to two highly publicized cases. The first case presented an act of individual commission. In 1937, the Frankfurter Zeitung reported the case of a farmer charged with shooting to death his adolescent, behaviorally disturbed son as the boy slept. Charged with murder and facing the death penalty if convicted, the father justified his actions by suggesting that his son's emotional disabilities made the son, quote, mentally ill in a manner that threatened society. At trial, in addition to the harm to others' defense, the father's attorneys and Nazi party officials argued forcefully that the son had been an unnecessarily heavy financial burden to the family. The father was sentenced to only 3 years in prison, of which he only served 1. The second case signified a critical shift from individual citizens responsible for and commission of mercy killing to these actions by the state, that is, state-approved involuntary killing by others based only on the disability of the victim. The victim was born on the 20th of February 1939 in southeastern Saxony. His name, as we found out this year, after all these years, we finally know his name. His name was Gerhard Herbert Kretschmar. Gerhard was a frail little boy with several severe disabilities. He was blind, without one leg and part of one arm, severely mentally retarded, and subject to chronic convulsions. His father, an agricultural laborer, petitioned the Nazi authorities to grant his son a merciful death, but received no official response. He persisted until in the winter of 1938-39, little Gerhard was finally admitted to the University of Leipzig's pediatric clinic. Aside from his obvious physical and intellectual disabilities, the father asserted that the child, by remaining at home, was causing his wife significant psychological and emotional stress. He requested the physicians proceed by, quote unquote, putting it to sleep. Initially, the doctors refused, reminding the father that such action was illegal. Undaunted, the father, encouraged by the child's grandmother apparently, petitioned Hitler directly to sanction the child's death. Arguably, the persistence of this one man became the catalyst for official genocide. Hitler's personal attending physician, Karl Brandt, was dispatched to Leipzig to examine the child and to evaluate the extent of the child's disability and to meet with the Leipzig consulting physicians to confirm the father's view. Brandt had further been directed that should the child indeed be so severely disabled, he should instruct the attending physicians in the name of the state to, quote unquote, carry out euthanasia. At his trial after the war, Brandt emphasized that part of the rationale in this approach was to absolve the parents and doctors of any guilt or incrimination that they were responsible for their child's death. Hitler, on behalf of the state, assumed responsibility for the death of the Kretschmar child, directing Brandt to assure the physicians that any legal repercussions resulting from their actions would be quashed.